It is noon, so we're going to get started. If there are other people who join us along the way, that is wonderful. We have hopefully a very meaningful webinar for you today. I'm going to start by first introducing myself. Welcome to the Bronson HealthNet webinar on sex and gender, health and history. My name is Abby Leonard. I am the Patient Safety and Quality Coordinator here at Bronson that oversees the integration of sex and gender into our clinical care processes and our entire system, actually, truly. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to do just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We are doing this via Teams today, this webinar, so that it could be recorded and shared and made available to people outside of this webinar who could not attend. So that means that this is being recorded. We will stop the recording at the end of the webinar section before we start the question and answer. The Q&A portion will be done without recording, so we'll stop it at that point. We're going to have a couple of questions along the way, some statistics and some data that we're going to talk about and have a few questions that you guys are going to be able to respond to or guess what you think the answer is. How you would do that is in the chat function. So at the top of your screen, you'll see the word chat, a little bubble and lines on it. If you click on that, it'll open your chat to the right-hand side of your screen. And then you should be able to, when that time comes up to use the chat, you should be able to put your responses there. If at any point you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. I will answer them as I see them if they're connected to what we're talking about. If they're connected to something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on, I may hold that question until we are on to that portion of the topic. But I'll make sure that I address all of those before the end today. I'm going to share my screen, and we will get started. So I am here today to present to you on a topic and do some background around sex and gender. Bronson is doing a lot of work in the last 4 years around this topic to truly understand and dive into the research and literature on sex and gender to understand what it means for our healthcare system as we expand how we use this information to provide exceptional care to all of our patients. And we want to share some of that learning with you today so that you can do the same thing where you are as leaders in our communities and as part of the communities that we serve. I'm not one that I don't read all the slides as I go through, but this is one that I will read, so I do apologize on that. We'll get started. So just a statement of unity here. So Bronson recognizes that this topic is associated with religious and political conflict, and that discussing sex and gender with our patients and community members can create heightened emotions. We are doing our best to navigate these discussions with care and respect for those community members with opposing worldviews. Bronson serves everyone. That means we serve people with a variety of medical needs from diverse backgrounds and experiences. Equitable sex and gender care is provided to all of our patients. And we want to be clear that there is unity among trusted healthcare organizations on the importance of sex and gender and its component parts, including your sexual orientation and gender identity, to your health and healthcare. We are committed to creating environments of belonging for everyone we serve and employ. Bronson will continue to act in ways that are driven by our values and informed by best practices. We strongly believe that as individuals and as an organization, we can focus on our shared vision of exceptional healthcare for every person, also respecting the beliefs and values of each person. These number of the organizations who are aligned with us on this unity statement on the importance of sex and gender into health and healthcare and medicine. Our objectives for today's webinar are to define common terms related to the domains of sex and gender and sexual orientation, to understand the difference between sex and gender and their component parts, to explore a brief American history of LGBTQIA+ treatment, to describe why the LGBTQIA population experiences inequities, to explore the history of English pronouns, and to understand the importance of using personal identifiers respectfully. We'll also end this with providing you with resources that you can take outside of this webinar to learn more. Before we dive into the topics of sex and gender, when we talk about sex and gender, we're really talking about sex and gender as it applies to absolutely everyone. But we know that this topic comes to us from the portion of the population that identifies as LGBTQIA+. And so we want to be able just to acknowledge those things, talk about some of the definitions so that we're all on the same page using the same language before we dive in. So I'm going to very briefly go over the terms that we have in front of you here to kind of just give an overarching definition to each of these so that we're on that same page as we continue to talk. So in the terms that you have, L stands for lesbian. So this is a woman who is primarily attracted to women. G stands for gay. This is a man who's primarily attracted to men, although this is a overarching term that is used by people who identify as both male and female as far as how they identify. So you will see that particularly more towards the men in that community, but it is used by everyone. Bisexual, that is what the B stands for. That is a term where an individual is attracted to someone of both their own and opposite gender. A person who identifies as transgender, that is the T. That is someone whose gender identity is not the same as their sex assigned at birth. And we'll go more into that a little bit later. The other T is on here because it's important to acknowledge the existence of this term historically and to discuss how and when we would use this term. So the additional T here would stand for transsexual, and that is an outdated term that used to represent when someone went through surgical or hormonal therapies to transition. That is an outdated term. I only bring it up here because I still hear it occasionally out and about. It's really not a term that we should be using anymore. It is not used in the medical realm at all. Q stands for queer. So queer is one of those terms that people can feel very unsure about how to use. And that is very fair. There is a mixed history on the use of the term queer. And historically, it really was used as to denigrate or to insult this community. Similarly to the F word that I will not use here, that word was used as an insult. It's really been that recently that term is being recaptured. The power of the insults being taken away by really owning that language and using it as a sense of pride. And so what you'll see is there are a number of folks who do use that term in a positive manner, although there are those folks who receive that negatively because of how it has been used historically. That term queer really is just an overarching umbrella term for anyone who identifies outside of traditional or heteronormative definitions. So that's what that is, an overarching term for that. Whether or not you should use the word queer really depends on the situation that you're in. Because of its mixed history, I always just reflect the language that someone is using to describe themselves. So if an individual uses the term queer to describe themselves, it is safe to and affirming to use that term to describe them back, as long as you're doing so to be respectful. But if you're not sure, then you can go ahead and avoid the use of the term, because we do know that that term has been used to harm folks and can be negatively triggering. Another cue that's in here is questioning. So as we go through the process of life, we are continually shaping and changing who we are and learning who we are, and not just in this realm of sex and gender, but the whole picture of our human experience. And so that cue that stands for questioning is really that the phase of time that people go through as they are trying to figure out how they identify, and that can occur at a lot of different times across the lifespan, It can happen in youth, but it can actually happen at any point in adulthood as well. I is a term that I stands for the term intersex, and we're also going to get into that in a little bit as well, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is a term related to variations in biological sex. A stands for two different things. It stands for allied. This is typically refers to someone who does not identify as LGBTQ+, that ensures that there are safe spaces and advocates for this community and creates environments of belonging and safety for this community. The term A for asexual stands for folks who do not feel sexual attraction towards others. What I mean by that is asexual is not the same thing as celibacy. Someone who is celibate is a person who does feel sexual attraction towards others, but chooses not to act on that sexual attraction. An individual who identifies as asexual, a coming from Latin meaning without, that is an individual who does not feel sexual attraction towards others. That does not mean they don't have romantic attraction or intimate relationships with individuals. It means they do not feel that sexual attraction to anyone. The term pansexual, which is that P you see there, this is another sort of umbrella term. That pan means global. That's what that prefix means. But what that means in the everyday sense is that for folks who identify as pansexual, typically it's the person's sex or gender is irrelevant to what attracts them to them. So what that means is there's some other, maybe it's their energy they put off, or that spiritual sense of self that they may have. There's some other component to their character and to who they are that is what is attractive to someone. And it may be anyone of any gender or any biological sex. It's really about that other piece that they find attractive that is outside of the parameters of physical anatomy or gender identity. That's a very high level overview of these terms. Obviously, there's more terms that fall within this. As we continue to learn more about sex and gender, the language around this is evolving. And so we continue to have change in that language, which is pretty common and normal. If you look at the patterns of language over time, that etymology of language, it's always changed. So we're just at a period of change, and we're even more so as we continue to do more research and learn more about sex and gender as a whole. So when we talk about that umbrella of terms that fit underneath there, how many people identify with one of those terms or one of the terms that I did not define for you today that fall within the LGBTQ plus umbrella? And we're learning a lot about this community is much bigger than we initially anticipated. And we're realizing that there are a lot of variations depending on where we get this information. Where you're going to find that number. So the prevalence of the LGBTQ community is somewhere between 7 and 20% of the population. Why you see that variation is because every survey is different. So how they ask questions is different. There's going to be differences in people who participate in the surveys. So there are regional differences, there are age differences. There are a number of other variables that would ultimately lead us to having a variation between 7 and 20 depending on the survey. We do also know that 1.6 million Americans over the age of 13 identify as transgender, and that 1.2 million Americans identify as non-binary. And I'll go into the term of what non-binary means in just a little bit. But when we're talking about the prevalence of this community, it's helpful for us to understand that in relation to other common variations in the human condition. What I mean by that is, if we consider that 10% of the population is left-handed and 2% of the population have green eyes, if you were to combine the population of folks who are transgender non-binary, it's very close to 2%. When we think about our systems, our employment practices, our organizations, our communities, we think about why would we want to make changes to what we're doing for such a small portion of the population? And I always challenge folks to come back and say, what if, from a healthcare standpoint, and this would apply to your businesses, depending on what service you provide, would you make changes if our system or our service did not allow us to care for patients who are left-handed? Would we make changes to our systems and processes if our services did not allow us to care for patients who had green eyes? And when we think about the prevalence of the community within that context, it reminds us of the importance of why we're doing this work, and that there are real people behind this work that we're doing it for, in order for our communities and our services and all of us to truly be together and to be authentically show up as a community. I'm going to give a very brief recent history that's going to cover a few different things from a legislative side of things. I'm not giving my political opinion on the legislation one way or the other. I'm just sharing with you, and I will make sure that if it is legislation, I'll connect it to the health and well-being of this community so that you understand why I'm bringing it up. But it is very relevant, especially when we think about it from a health and well-being and an employment standpoint for this community. So in 1950, the government did a covert investigation into the sexual orientation of all federal employees. It took them 2 years to complete the secret investigation. At the end of this secret investigation, two things happened. Immigration of the LGBTQ plus community was banned into the United States. I have the language of there of homosexuals and other sexual perverts. It's there because that was the language of the act of the time. I'll say LGBTQ plus going forward. As well as that ban on immigration, there was also the American Psychiatric Association named it a sociopathic personality disorder. The following year, there was an executive ban for employment for the LGBTQ plus community. So I'll repeat that. In 1950, there was a secret investigation into the sexual orientation of all federal employees. It took them 2 years to do that. At the end of that investigation, American Psychiatric Association named it a mental health disorder. Immigration was banned, and then the following year, employment was banned. In 1958, the Supreme Court ruled that social services could not be used to track individuals. Specifically, one of the ways they conducted that covert or secret investigation in 1950 is that they started to track people's mail using the United States Postal Service. Basically, what pieces of mail they were receiving. Specifically, they were tracking individuals who were receiving mail that was considered homosexual or LGBT plus focused, since there was a magazine called One Magazine at the time. So anyone who was receiving that magazine was being tracked. That was one of the ways that they identified whether or not you were LGBTQ plus, or whether or not you should be employed. And so in 1958, they did rule they couldn't use those social services to track individuals. Why is that incredibly important? When we think about the changes that are happening now in the healthcare system, the changes that you may be looking at your organizations about asking additional questions to be able to create inclusive environments, we have to be very aware that there is trust issues in this space, because historically, how social services or other groups have tracked, including healthcare, have tracked this information has been used to harm this community. So that it's very important that we're aware of that historical harm as we step into this space going forward. In 1969 were the Stonewall riots. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Stonewall riots, but that happened in New York. Essentially what was going on is that it was illegal to be LGBTQ plus, and they would not provide any licenses to LGBTQ organizations. And so underground organizations and places were set up for folks to come together and be together, because they were not able to do so legally. And ultimately, and in an effort to clean the streets during an election period, the police commissioner was sending out paddy wagons and police to these areas to forcibly arrest people and forcibly take them to mental health institutions. Ultimately, this resulted in a number of riots, and that's where you started to see that active protesting occurring for this community. In 1970 was the first Gay Pride March. People are pretty familiar with Pride now, right? Everyone knows June is Pride, and there's usually, celebrations and lots of colorful things and the flag and all of that. But it's really important that we remember where Pride comes from. The very first Pride March was a very quiet, somber protest march for the violence that had occurred the year previous. So that protest march that was not a celebration, that had become the celebration of Pride that it is today. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its mental disorders list. So for those of you that can quickly do the math there, through all of human history, being LGBTQ plus has been a mental health disorder for exactly 21 years. And even though it was only considered a mental health disorder for 21 years, and the American Psychiatric Association came out and apologized for its participation in the events that occurred historically, and redacted its designations, that stigma of mental health disease associated with this community continues to persist today. In 1979 was the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. That's where we saw the pride flag for the first time. And in 1993 was the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. So if you saw in 1953, there was an executive order banning all employment of LGBTQ plus folks. So for a 40-year period from 1953 to 1993, this community was not allowed to be employed. And actively, if they were in the closet or hiding their identity at their place of employment in order to have employment, they were, if anything was found out, they lost their jobs for that. They could not maintain their employment. In 1993, a policy went in place that said, okay, if you don't tell us your identity, we won't ask your identity, and so we won't actively be seeking the information. And so rather than actively looking for the information or reinforcing folks for outing people at work, they said, we're just going to not talk about it anymore. In 1998, Matthew Shepard was murdered. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Matthew Shepard, since it's been a little bit too as well, but that's one of those watershed moments, similar to the murder of George Floyd. This is a moment that got a lot of public attention in the news and media, that it highlighted the violence that this community faces on a daily basis. Unfortunately for Matthew Shepard, he was a 21-year-old college student who was taken out into a field by a group of college kids, tied to a fence, tortured, and left to die. It took Matthew 6 days to die. In 2003, the Supreme Court ruled that Texas could no longer criminalize homosexuality. So up until 2003, in some states across this country, it was still legal to be LGBTQ+. In 2010, there was the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. That was essentially not to take us back to 1953, but to say that you are supposed to be able to be openly LGBTQ at work without fear of reprisal. That being said, even though they did repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, the protections or federal protections for employment for this community did not exist until June of 2022. In 2015, same-sex marriage was legalized. The reason why that matters when we're talking about employment practices, when we're talking about health and well-being and thriving, it's not in relation to the spiritual connection or even the romantic connection of marriage, but talking about the institution from a legal standpoint and what that brings and what access to wealth and healthcare and resources does that institution bring an individual. I have a star beyond 2015 because I think most of us should be well aware that there are hundreds I removed lawsuits instead of legislation. I apologize, I have a wrong word there. There are hundreds of legislation in place right now, moving through various court systems that are discriminatory against this population around participation in sports, adoption rights, healthcare representation and education, parental rights, and things like that. There are, last I checked in May, there were over 600 bills on the books right now, various phases of moving through the legislature around against this community. So with the story that I just shared with you and the acknowledgement and recognition of the tension that exists outside of our healthcare system and that exists within our communities, why change? why start asking these questions and start incorporating sex and gender differently in how we interact with each other? And the truth is, we've actually always done it. We've always incorporated sex and gender, including a person's sexual orientation and gender identity, into their employment experience and into the benefit plans for our employees. We've also always included it into their healthcare plan from a health and well-being side point. It's just that in the past, we assumed that a person's sexual orientation and gender identity was heterosexual and cisgender, unless they told us otherwise. If we think about all the things I just shared with you that occurred since 1950 alone, we know that there are a number of reasons why someone would not have shared that information. And so functioning on assumptions is not a safe practice. This is where we're going to do some of the chance for you to guess what you think the answers are to the questions. So feel free to type in the chat what you think, A, B, C, or D. What is the rate of workplace discrimination for LGBTQIA plus people? Is it 14%, 25%, 38%, or 43%? What do you think? Put it in the chat. Anyone brave enough to guess? Okay. I will encourage you to guess on the next question then. It is C, 38%. So 38% of LGBTQIA people experience discrimination and harassment in the workplace. And this comes from data from 2021. So if you think about your places of employment, the places in the community in which you serve, this could represent more than 1 out of 3 LGBTQ plus people in your organization. Next question. Hopefully I'll get some people in the chat this time. What is the rate of LGBTQIA plus employee turnover related to employer treatment? Is it 8%, 17%, 26%, or 34%? Any guesses?
Abby, are you able to see the chat? There were several responses in the last question.
I had the chat open and I didn't see anything. Seriously? What's wrong with my chat? I didn't see anything. Will you help me out, Dr. Johnson? Would you mind telling me what guesses people have out there?
Absolutely. So we see, let's see. There are several D's. Looks like the majority are D, and we have a few C's and a couple B's.
Well, thank you so much for catching that. I appreciate that. Let's see. It is D. 34.2% of LGBTQIA plus people left their job in the last year due to how they were treated by their employer. In your places of employment, this could represent more than 1 out of 3 LGBTQIA plus people. Thank you for the responses. Next question. What percent of LGBTQIA plus youth considered suicide in the last year? Is it 10%, 18%, 32%, or 45%? What do you think?
There are variable responses so far between C and D.
All right, everybody ready to see? It is D. Unfortunately, 45% of LGBTQIA youth considered whether or not it'd be worth it to live because of their identity in the last year. What percent of LGBTQIA plus youth live in affirming homes? Affirming is defined by those spaces that allow you to authentically be who you are without shame and support who you are. So what percent of LGBTQIA youth live in affirming homes? Safe, shame-free home environments. 22%, 37, 56, or 71.
So this one seems to have a split between A and B, and there are a couple C's.
Wonderful. All right, you ready? It is B. Only 30% of LGBTQ plus youth live in affirming homes. What does that mean? We're talking about it from a workplace perspective. The things that we do at work, our experiences at work, the things we learn at work, are the cultures and the people that we interact with, our coworkers and things like that, the things that we talk about, that influences us, and it has the potential to reinforce or promote stigmatization or bias or shame that influences the employees' behaviors at home as well. And the same can be said for the opposite. I know that there's often a discussion around mental health conditions in this community. And so we go, well, how do we know? How do we know that this isn't a mental health condition and that's not the primary issue? The reason why we know that is because we're able to see drastic differences in the lived experiences and suicide rate and well-being of people completely dependent upon the environment in which they live. Meaning, so for what they found was that for those youth that have a very unaccepting community, the rate of suicide was 21%. As that rate of accepting or the amount of accepting increased, the rate of suicidality or suicide risk went down significantly. So the difference for this community between a very unaccepting community and a very accepting community is more than half the rate of suicide goes down when that individual who's LGBTQIA lives in a very accepting community. Being LGBTQIA plus is not a mental health condition. Stigmatization, discrimination, and violence towards LGBTQIA people causes psychological distress and trauma that leads to mental health conditions. When we talk about this community from a healthcare perspective, it really matters when we think about, yes, we talk about healthcare and health outcomes and what are disease states and how are people surviving, what's life expectancy, and all these sorts of numbers that are healthcare related, but they really are more determined by the environment and the conditions of the environment than they are to the actual healthcare that an individual receives. And so it's really important when we talk about health disparities and health outcomes and the rate of conditions and or diseases in certain communities and what role we have in creating the environment outside of the healthcare system that contributes to these disparities in health outcomes. I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So the LGBTQ plus community faces significant health inequities because of the impact of stigma, discrimination, minority stress, and healthcare system barriers. That's a very big sentence. I'm going to break it apart a little bit. What does inequities mean? I have two terms on that slide. One says health disparities, one says health inequities. What's the difference? A disparity is a measured difference between two groups of people or more. So that's what a disparity is. It's a measured difference. An inequity is when that measured difference is preventable and therefore unjust. That's the difference between a disparity and an inequity, is that the difference between people is preventable and therefore unjust, and therefore it's an inequity. Why does this occur? It is because of the impact of stigma. And I don't know how familiar you are with that term of stigma or stigmatization, but stigma is really just societal shame. It's the collective value that we place as a society on a specific characteristic. And people face stigma for a lot of different reasons. They can face stigma for mental health conditions. They can face stigma for being part of the LGBTQ community. They can face stigma for addiction. You can face stigma for choosing to work to be a stay-at-home mom, or you can face stigma for choosing to work outside the home. It's the valuation and the shame-based system that we have that we place on people collectively based on a specific characteristic. Minority stress, I'm going to get into in just a minute. That has to actually do with physiological changes in the body due to chronic stress. And then the healthcare system barriers, as we talked about, when we think about that timeline of the laws that went in place, when in our country, because of the way our healthcare system is set up, when we look at that and we look at employment practices, the two are inextricably connected. You cannot pull them apart. So for a ban in employment essentially equals a ban in access to healthcare, because in our country, your access to healthcare services, how much is covered, where it's covered, what you can get, how you can get it, is completely connected to your employment practices or your income level. So there are a number of healthcare system barriers that exist because of the other barriers that exist within the communities we serve and the structures in those communities. So when you have all of these pieces together, the stigma and discrimination, the environmental or the social determinants within the environment that influence this, and healthcare system barriers, you have higher rates of psychological distress. So you have strain on mental health, but that is related to a lack of support from social support structures and system support structures, as well as relationships. You also have higher rates of chronic illness. Now, the higher rates of chronic illness is secondary. So it's meaning, when I say secondary, it means it's not inherent. You don't have, there aren't higher rate of a specific illness because it's just inherent to being LGBTQ+. There are higher rates of certain conditions because of it's secondary to the impact of chronic stress, sociocultural factors, and health behaviors. So when you have all of those factors, then you have an increased risk of chronic illness. You do also have an increased rate of maladaptive coping mechanisms. What's a maladaptive coping mechanism? That is anything that we do to cope with stress that is not considered healthy for our bodies. I have yet to meet a single person, including myself, that does not have a maladaptive coping mechanism. We all have them. Healthy coping mechanisms are actually a privilege. In order to engage in healthy coping mechanisms, you often need to have other things set up in your environment that allow you to be able to engage in those healthy coping mechanisms. So healthy coping mechanisms really are a privilege, and maladaptive coping mechanisms are something that we all have. But when you have increased structural barriers, you have increased stress and strain on a community, then you're going to see higher rates of those coping mechanisms. And when you have those higher rates of those coping mechanisms, like eating disorders, alcoholism, smoking, risk-taking behaviors, then you're going to have higher incidence of disease. We also have decreased access to resources. I won't go a whole lot into that because we talked about that when we think about ban and employment, and therefore an access to healthcare issue as well. When you think about healthcare and insurance and homelessness, this community has a much higher rate of homelessness. Then you can see where those decreased access to systemic decreased accesses to resources would change our health outcomes. So we're going to talk about, we're getting close. Wow, time goes by fast. We're going to dive in, spend just a little bit of time here on this because this is really more of a medical model, but it is how the environmental life stressors actually influence and change the physiology of the body. It actually causes our autonomic nervous system, which is our fight or flight mechanism. It's supposed to turn on and turn off. It actually causes it to be turned on all of the time. And those things within that mechanism, like increased heart rate and increased blood pressure, that's going to help you run away from the bear super fast. Those things stay on all the time as well, leading to higher rates of cardiovascular disease. Now I'm done talking about the LGBTQIA community. I'm going to now talk about sex and gender. This is really where I want to get into the meat of what we're going to talk about today and why it matters to your place of employment. When we're talking about sex and gender, those terms, there's a lot of debate about what does that mean and do they mean the same thing? And now we're understanding they mean two different things. But in fact, they really do. And historically, even in the language use, the etymology of the language, they have historically also meant two different things. But for the purposes of healthcare and what we're talking about today, I want to break those down a little bit. When we're talking about sex, we're talking about biological sex. And biological sex is a combination of hormone production and hormone response. When I say hormones, we think sex-based hormones, because we're talking about sex here. Hormones are just chemicals that move through the body. It is literally the information highway of the body. Those chemicals are how the body talks to each other in between all the different organs and cells. So there's lots of different types of hormones. Insulin, for example, is a hormone. So when you're talking about production of sex-based hormones or the response to, it's a little bit like type 1 or type 2 diabetes, where in type 1 diabetes, the body does not produce insulin. The beta cells in the pancreas do not produce insulin. So you don't have that hormone available for use. In type 2 diabetes, the body produces insulin. That's not the issue. The cells don't respond to the insulin, so they don't take it up and use it. So while you may have that hormone available, it's not getting used. When we talk about sex-based hormones, it's exactly the same. Both the production of and response to those hormones across the body, and there are a lot of variations. Biological sex also includes chromosomes. When we think about chromosomes, we think about like as a recipe. There are variations in our chromosomes as well. We think XX and XY pretty typically, but there are additional chromosome variations like triple X, single X, XXY, that are not those XXXY. And so you do have variations as well. When we're talking about anatomy, that's that third piece that comes into sex. So when we're talking about biological sex, we mean this whole picture. We mean all of these pieces coming together. Anatomy is both primary and secondary. So a primary anatomy has to do with those things related to reproduction, and secondary anatomy has to do with those things that we typically associate with being masculine or feminine. So body hair distribution, body fat distribution, breast size, vocal tone, things like that. Things that are not directly associated with reproduction, but that we associate with specific sexes. Those are that secondary anatomy piece. So when we're talking about biological sex from a medical standpoint and from a human standpoint, we're talking about this whole picture. And biological sex actually changes across the lifespan. We are not, when we're born, it's not fully matured. And actually, when we pass away, it's no longer fully functional. It changes quite a bit, and the hormones actually change. And that's why you see a lot of physical changes or body hair distribution changes when you get older, body fat distribution changes, because those hormones have changed along the lifespan as well. Why is this so incredibly important when I talk about this? People very often focus on the external genitalia as the sense of sex. But when we talk about biological sex, we're talking about much bigger things than that. The system is much bigger and much more nuanced than that. So with talking about biological sex and limiting how we talk to it to just the external genitalia or how that person is able to engage in sexual intercourse, limiting sex, biological sex, that is like the cardiovascular system in your body, and it's like only talking about the mechanical pumping function of the heart. It's a very limited component of the bigger picture. Gender itself, this is a culture-dependent term that links societal norms, behaviors, and expectations with specific sexes, and gender varies across cultures. And so this is typically where we see pink is for girls and blue is for boys, or who's the caregiver, who's the breadwinner, what roles exist, what do you look like, what do you wear, things like that. Those are those rules that we set as a culture. And so when we look at how we define gender, it is a very culture dependent term because not every culture defines gender, the expectations for gender the same. This is something that you may have seen before. This is called the genderbread person. I always start with this slide at the very, very top, and that is the genderbread person in all of us. And that's incredibly important. And why I do that, and it's very intentional. And that is because the more that we've learned about sex and gender, and the more that we've done this work as a healthcare organization, the more we've realized that we've never talked about it and approached it from that true full picture. And so we're doing the research now, we're learning more now, and we're realizing now that we have this language around us, that this is something that everybody has. So when I go through these terms, and I'm going to go for a minute, I'm going to challenge each of you to privately to yourself, kind of think about, how does this term apply to me? What's my gender identity? What's my gender expression? How do these terms apply to me? Because these are really just terms that apply to the human condition as a whole, not to a specific subset of the population. So gender identity, that is a person's internal sense of being female, male, combination of both, or neither. This is your internal sense of self. This is who I am. Gender expression is our outward expression of our gender identity. It's how we tell the world who we are. And it's usually measured in like femininity or masculinity in our clothing attire and things like that. Biological sex, for the purposes of the gender-bred person, I've combined it with sex assigned at birth. I'll go into that in just a little bit. But from a medical standpoint, biological sex is that whole picture that we were just talking about. But there's also the sex assigned at birth that people often think of, which is specific to your anatomy, your external genitalia anatomy. But that's what we're talking about. That has to do with the physiology of the individual. When we talk about sexual orientation, we're talking about a person's innate romantic, emotional, or sexual attraction towards others. Now, this is split out between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. This is pretty straightforward, and most people know that they could be sexually attracted to somebody and not romantically attracted to them, and vice versa. So that attraction is different. So that varies across folks as well. And then you do have your legal sex, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but honestly, the legal sex is just the administrative part. It is the paperwork component of your personal identity. So I'm going to break that down a little bit more from the sex piece of it, because I had three terms that I threw at you. I had legal sex, biological sex, and sex assigned at birth. So what's the difference? Legal sex is actually legal gender. It is the social and administrative information that reflects a person's gender identity. And the reason why it's legal gender and not legal sex is because it reflects a person's gender identity. It does not reflect their personal anatomy. And I don't say personal sex because we don't actually, your ID is never going to show your complete biological sex picture, right? That is an indicator for some folks of anatomy, right? And so from a HIPAA standpoint, it's not really, from the privacy practices standpoint, it's really not appropriate in a social context to have that medical information available at the social level. That is private information. So it's appropriate for the legal sex to truly be legal gender. But that's what it is. And you'll see it on I'll talk about a little bit, that shows up a little differently now on state IDs than it used to. Biological sex is that full picture, right? That reflects that whole pathophysiology of the individual, their chromosomes, their hormones, and their anatomy. It's the complete picture. Sex assigned at birth is not the complete picture of a person's biological sex. Sex assigned at birth is just the external anatomy. It's one component of a person's biological sex that is designated to them at the time of birth. And it is, at this time, given our practices, the best information we have to drive clinical decision-making from a healthcare standpoint. But we do have to acknowledge that it is not the full biological sex picture. And the reason why that's so incredibly important to acknowledge is because biological sex is not binary. So it is not just only male or only female. And that's what I mean by binary. There has always been and will always be individuals who are intersex. Intersex is a term that describes a person who's born with a variation to one of those three things I was talking about. It's a variation of the chromosomes, the hormone production or response, or a variation in anatomy that does not strictly align with male or female sexes. So how often does this happen? Again, we're learning a lot more. Research is in this space and is growing significantly, but because historically it really was limited. We did not truly focus on differences in sexual development. So we're learning a lot more. And what we are knowing now is that up to 1.7% of the population is born with a variation in one of those three things. And so we don't always know right away either. So the reason why sex assigned at birth and being very specific about that is so important is because an individual who's intersex, that may be picked up at birth if their external genitalia does not align. If the variation exists with their external genitalia, we may notice that at birth. But if that's not where their variation exists, then we may not even notice that until they enter into puberty. We also pick it up on family planning stages, but there are folks who have specific variations that will never know that they're intersex because their specific variation did not require additional follow-up with a provider. Transition to a little bit more detail about gender, the gender piece of it. There is no universal set of rules for gender or gender expression. Across the world, how we express ourselves varies, both in groups and individually, and how we define those rules and roles for each other based on our gender varies across cultures as well. There is not a universal set of rules for gender or gender expression. When we think of gender identity, there's a common term that fall under that umbrella. So the term most frequently heard is transgender. These prefixes come from Latin. So trans means to shift or to change. So think transfer, transcend, transition, right? That just means to shift or change. So an individual who identifies as transgender, that means that their gender identity is different than the sex they were assigned at birth. It's very important to also separate out a gender identity from sexual orientation. Someone who is transgender may identify as straight, gay, bisexual, or any other sexual orientation, because they're two different things. While there are patterns or trends in human behavior between genders and attraction, one does not dictate the other. What I mean by that is your gender identity is your internal sense of self. Your sexual orientation is how you're attracted to others. So while there are patterns of behaviors that are common, the one does not automatically dictate the other. Cisgender is a term that cis comes from Latin as well. It means same. So, for example, my gender identity is female. My sex assigned at birth is female. So I'm cisgender. So an individual whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth is cisgender. This is a medical term that is common in medical areas. You're hearing it more and more commonly in their communities as well, but that is just the term that reflects the person whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth, which is me. Non-binary is a term that represents an individual whose internal sense of self is neither solely male or solely female. This exists on a spectrum. And so it could be a combination of both or neither of them. So it's someone who exists outside of the binary definitions of male and female. I often get the question, what is gender affirming care? Because there's a lot of discussion happening around gender affirming care. What is it? And so I wanted to kind of talk about briefly here to give you a little bit of background. Gender affirming care is an umbrella term for a wide range of both social and medical therapies and treatments that support a person's sex and gender health and well-being based on their individual needs and goals. So when we talk about gender affirming care, it includes things like using someone's chosen name and pronouns. It means outward expressions of their gender. It means social recognition that aligns with gender identity, legal recognition that aligns with their gender identity, mental health therapy, which is the primary type of gender affirming therapy or gender affirming care, puberty blocking therapies. There's a lot of confusion around these. So just a little bit of information on this. Puberty blockers, this is a reversible pause button that is given to kiddos who are experiencing distress related to being non-binary, transgender, or questioning themselves. And so the number one thing we need to do is give people time to be able to process what's happening. And so a puberty blocker allows them to put a pause button on the start of those disruptive puberty developments physically to give time for that child to process what it is that they're experiencing. And then before they make bigger decisions. Hormone replacement therapies are those that when we're actually supplementing hormone or giving it to someone. And this happens within adolescence to adulthood. Then you have aesthetic surgeries, or you can think of the old term as cosmetic surgeries, same sort of thing. That happens in adults only. And then sexual health therapies, which happens with adults only as well. So when we're talking about gender affirming care, we're talking about the overarching umbrella of services. And so it's important to know that one size does not fit all. Not everyone is going to have all of those services, and everyone's going to participate in all of those pieces. Everyone's going to individually determine what's right for them between themselves, their family, and their provider. Question to the group. What demographic is the #1 consumer of gender-affirming care? And Dr. Johnson, I will lean on you for the comments. Type in the chat, what do you think is the demographic is the #1 consumer of gender-affirming care?
Okay, we have menopausal women, cis folks, female, teens.
You guys are right on the money.
White females. There we go.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Cisgender adults. So I know that gender affirming care is often associated with the transgender and non-binary community, but actually when we're talking about the overarching services that encompass gender affirming care, the #1 consumer of gender affirming care are cisgender adults. Within that, women, followed by cisgender men, just slightly thereunder. So one example would be, why would we use a hormone blocker, or not a hormone blocker, sorry. Why would we use, the hormone blocker, which is that reversible pause. Why would we do that on someone who's cisgender and not transgender, a kiddo? For a number of medical reasons. So when we think about these things and how we treat kids as well, gender affirming care is also for cisgendered youth. There are a number of therapies that occur related to that, early onset menses, things like that. I also want to share gender and sex from a historical perspective a little bit. So while we're talking about these a lot now in our communities, many cultures and traditions around the world and throughout history have recognized sex and gender beyond male and female. And I'll provide just a couple of examples here, and there are links as well to learn more. So here are a few examples of same-sex relationships in our ancient cultures: Humatep and Neancommon in 2400 BC, Idet and Ryu in 1480 to 1390. Within the U.S. and U.S. territories, each of our indigenous peoples have a term within their native language for additional genders or a third gender. There is a collective term, and you'll see them listed there. There is a collective term that is being used, a modern term across indigenous languages. It's called two-spirit, and that it reflects, is used between for those individuals that identify as non-binary or transgender within those communities. The term that you see at the very bottom of that list, guevadoche, that actually has to do with variations in intersex. So in the Dominican Republic, there's a higher rate of intersex individuals born, and the variation guevadoche specifically results in an individual being assigned sex birth female at birth, but then developing a penis with the onset of puberty. Another example of an transgender individual within early American history would be Albert Casher. Albert was born Jenny Hodgers and served as a transgender soldier in the Union Army during the Civil War. When we talk about sex and gender and the lived experiences of folks who are LGBTQ+, there's a lot, if you haven't lived it, that you don't know. That's just the reality of it. And because of that, in order to empathize with someone's experience that you yourself have not lived, you have to be willing to believe them as they see it and not how you imagine their experience to be. I'm going to break it down from a legal standpoint. When we're talking about think about your organizations and how might you use this information across your platforms that you might use, across your services that you might provide. So I just want to give a little high-level overview and why that matters, what information you're using. So when we're talking about legal sex, that's the administrative or legal gender. So you have three options at the state and federal level: F for female, M for male, X for non-binary. Sex assigned at birth is that external anatomy part. So If you look for an individual whose legal sex is female, which is really their legal gender, their sex assigned at birth may be female, male, unknown, or intersex, and their gender may be cisgender female or transgender female. So when we think about how our systems use this information and how we interact and set up structures of inclusion, making sure we understand when we're capturing someone's legal sex information, what does that mean in regards to their gender or their sex assigned at birth? Some other terms that you will hear is chosen name, legal name, and dead name. So I'll go over these briefly so that they have some clarity as to what they mean. Everyone has a chosen name. Every single person in this room, including myself, at one point in your life decided your name. You decided if you were going to go with the name given to you at birth, if you were going to go with a variation of that. I personally went with my name given at birth. We see that commonly. So when we're talking about chosen name, that's what we're talking about. So here are some examples that we see commonly that aren't automatically associated with the LGBTQ plus population. Things like Betsy Elizabeth Miller, who prefers to go by Liz Miller, or Robert, who goes by Bob. Charlene Mary Ezra, who goes by Charlie Ezra. Those are common changes that we see, and so we don't even think about it, but those are also chosen names. We all ultimately choose our name. And so it's really not until we excuse me, we see a difference in what we expect from a masculine to feminine name, or vice versa, feminine to masculine, that's where it catches our attention. But truly, a chosen name is something that everybody has. And a chosen name is how we should interact with everyone at all times, except for when we have to use their legal information for safety or legal purposes. The legal name is the name they use on that paperwork. And it changes for a number of reasons. I changed my legal name. The number one reason why people change their legal name is that they get married. There are a number of system barriers, and the reason why I wanted to talk about the legal name a little bit is that even though folks are able to update their information, their legal information to reflect their gender identity and their chosen name, there are a number of barriers for folks to doing that. So it's really important to remember that just because someone has not updated their legal information does not have anything to do with the validity of their identity. This legal name change processes cost money, but actually for the transgender and non-binary community, they also are associated with significant risk to safety. If you're going to have your name change done legally, you have to, one, be fingerprinted, but also you have to publicly publish your name change in a newspaper, both in online and print. So if you are a transgender individual who's going from a masculine to a feminine name or vice versa, you have to be willing to out yourself to the entire community you live in order to change your name legally. So in order for I wanted to change my name as a transgender individual, I would need to tell the entire county of Kalamazoo. Dead name is the name a person is given at birth that they no longer use. I technically have a dead name. I do not use, otherwise in a legal standpoint, the alias is another term that used to be used for dead name, right? Alias. The reason why there's that negative connotation with that is because dead naming is how we refer to someone using their birth name instead of their chosen name. And this can be intentional or accidental. So you may accidentally dead name someone and then you didn't mean to because you knew their name prior to the name change and you didn't know it now, or you haven't mentally made that shift yet in your head of that name change. And that can occur if they are transgender or if it's anyone else who's legally updated their name. But dead naming can be very, very harmful because it is the number one way socially between interpersonal relationships that people invalidate someone's gender identity. So even though we may do it as an accident, we have to remember as we interact with folks that we don't know how that name has actually been used to hurt them. And we don't know what that instinctive response might be because of the pain that's there. So you have to be aware of that. I'm going to cover pronouns. We are very much getting close to the end. I want to provide us at least 20 minutes of questions. But I do want to go over pronouns a little bit. They are challenging for folks. And I have to tell you that they have been challenging for me. I was raised in an environment where it was yes, sir, no, ma'am. And that's so it's very hard for me to remove the gender language from what I'm doing. There's an automated process to that I am working on because I know that I have used those words inappropriately, not just for individuals who are transgender and non-binary. I have misgendered cisgender folks that did not, my first glance, I made assumptions about their wrong gender. So this is something that is ingrained to how we communicate. And so it's hard. It's not an easy thing to do. And we're not expecting that. So it's helpful if we kind of know where the language came from, because that starts to empower us to engage in those changes. So pronouns are part of the English language that has changed multiple times in our history. The English language was actually heavily Germanic and not based in Latin. So your Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, those are all based in Latin. English is not actually based in Latin. And because of that, it was not highly respected in academic circles because academic language was primarily Latin. And so in order to make the English language more respected in academic circles, a group of English grammarians led by William Lilly in 1567 added stricter Latin grammar rules into the English language that include how we use our he for generic professions, as well as how we have a mixture of people like, hey guys, how's it going? The reason why we always default to the he, that is because of this change in 1567. And as William Lilly said himself, the reason why he selected the changes that he did for addition to the English language was because we're note that the masculine gender is more worthy than the feminine, and the feminine more worthy than the neuter. While I would not encourage you to use the term neuter, it is something to point out that in 1567 they did have a term for another gender. So that got incorporated into our the Latin grammar rules got incorporated into the English language, which became known as the King's Grammar. So if you were raised in the United States or anywhere under the King's Empire, you were taught the King's Grammar, and so that was the language that we were taught. Pronouns have also changed as a whole over time because their function changes over time. And so when their function changes, our patterns of use for them change. One really good example of that is thee and thou, which are actually the informal forms of you, the pronoun you. So historically, when literacy levels were really low and class, you would denote class by that. So if you were a lower class than I was, then I would say thee to you, right? And you or thou or thee to you when you say ye or you to me because I was a higher class than you. So the way that we use those pronouns from you for thee, thou, and you was really to denote social class. But as social class distinctions decreased and literacy levels increased, the you that we use today replaced all other forms of that. So the they, them that we see now is going through a similar transformation because the function of the word is changing a little bit. And so therefore the use of it in everyday language is changing a little bit. So what does that mean from a grammatical standpoint? Well, they, them, which is the most common personal pronouns outside of he, her, he, him, and his, and I can't talk today. Oh my goodness, you'd think through a webinar I'd be able to talk. He, him, and she, her, that one's the most common, and people often think that it is only for plural, and that this use for in the singular is new, and that's actually not the case. So the they, them has always indicated two different things. It can either mean plural, more than one, so Mark and Sarah will be late, they went to the store, or it can also denote or indicate familiarity. So I'm going to go visit my high school friend this weekend. They live in Seattle. I said they, it's a singular person. You don't know my high school friend. I didn't give information more than you to that. And so they is appropriate. Same thing for when like my mother will call me and she's like, I went to the doctor's office today. And I'll say, what did they say? I'm not talking about a collective 10 doctors. I'm just not familiar with her doctor. And so I replaced with a singular they. So the use of a singular they is actually very common. We just don't recognize it when we're using it. So if it helps, one of the ways that you can think about the singular they for folks who are non-binary or use that as their pronouns, depending on their gender identity, is to really think about it in that familiarity standpoint. We are not familiar, and we've not given permission to be that familiar with that individual. So you have not been given permission to be that familiar, to know what the personal anatomy is of that individual. So from a privacy standpoint, it's very appropriate to use they. So when we talk about using personal pronouns, it's often like we're going to be nice and respectful, so we're going to use pronouns. When truly it actually is a matter of privacy and consent. I have given you permission to have this much information about me, and this is how I want you to talk to me. It is privacy and it is consent. It's not just about being nice. So how do we go about asking people their personal identifiers? It's really much simpler, and it really just starts with, hi, my name is Abby. It's just that simple. It's all the other things that we do to adapt our interactions that'll let us know someone's personal identifier so that we can use it. It does not mean that we are saying, hi, my name is Abby, she, her, hers, every single time I'm entering into a conversation, or I'm asking someone their pronoun or chosen name every single time I'm in a conversation. It's about creating space for someone else's personal information without assumption. So how do you create that space? The first thing you do is try to challenge your assumptions. Avoid those assumptions. They are going to be there. So when they occur, challenge those assumptions. Use gender neutral language unless you're told otherwise. So, and that's for anybody. How may I help you instead of how may I help you, ma'am? They went to the store instead of she went to the store, if you have not been told what their pronouns are. You can also create visual cues. So you can put your pronouns, chosen name in virtual meetings or in your email signatures. There are a number of ways that you can visually create the space for pronouns without having to verbally ask everyone their pronouns. And if you make a mistake, honestly, the best thing you can do is self-correct and move on without making a big deal about it. So Chris is here. He is at table 9. Done. Moving on. You self-corrected. That's all that needs to happen in that space. And keep practicing. Practice it over and over. And the more you practice, the less mistakes you'll make over time. Because we have to do the best we can until we know better. And then when we know better, we have to do better. And now we know better. It is time to do better. So how do you do that in your organizations? It first starts with removing assumptions and having a space, creating the space for everyone to give their chosen name and pronouns, not requiring it, but creating the space for it to be possible. Use gender neutral wording if you don't know. Apologize and amend. It's your AAA customer service. Acknowledge, apologize, and amend. That is exactly the same, because we're all human and we're all learning. And so nobody's seeking perfection. No one in the LGBTQIA community expects perfection from anyone else either. It's really the humility that's needed, not perfection. So engage in self-reflection. Everyone has opportunities, including me, who does the work all day long. Lead by example. The best examples you can give are how you make a mistake and how you recover from a mistake, not perfection. Advocate for LGBTQIA families and employees and community members. Seek additional learning opportunities. And then within your own teams and systems, start using sex and gender to mean different things and start engaging in those conversations on how you use that information to make sure that you provide equitable employment practices or services to people. I'm not going to go over these. We are done. We're going to move to the question and answer section now, but I just want to make it available because this will also be sent out to everyone. Here are some additional resources around employment practices that you can do to create inclusive and equitable environments. here are some additional resources around some of the data where I got the data earlier, where you can find that there and read more about it, as well as some short videos. Everyone learns differently, so if you prefer to watch things, there are a number of videos here as well that you can watch to digest the information some more. Just want to remind everybody as we close this webinar section up that Bronson's HelpNet Services and Employee Assistance is here for you. The number is there. We provide services for counseling, work life, legal, financial, and management. And we just want to be there. If you need anything, our contact information is there. Then we're going to have what questions do we have? So if you want to stop, Lexi, if you want to stop the recording part of it, then we can open it up to questions to the group.